Hi, everybody. Welcome to Unpopular Front. I'm Ben. This is a new segment I want to do. I don't really have a name for it. I toy around with the idea of musical materialism because, like, the whole Marxist thing, but I don't really know if that really makes sense right now. But I wanted to talk about one of the most important bands of maybe the past 40 years, Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk, a Dusseldorf originally based German quartet. Went through a few iterations. All these top five albums are going to sort of be in the classic Kraftwerk um, electronic period, which is what they're known for. Really amazing group, one of the most important kraut rock bands or cosmic music bands. They influenced genres from experimental avant-garde art installation kind of stuff to early hip-hop, techno, electronica, a truly global band in a lot of ways that I think those of us who maybe speak primarily one of the more dominant languages across the world maybe don't fully grasp how global Kraftwerk are. Um, and I love them. I think they're really cool. I think they made some awesome music. I think they are just very unique in musical history. They had a whole sort of transformation in the early 70s when they were more of sort of like akin to sort of like more krautrock bands like Can. They were sort of in the same scene down in the sort of Rhineland area, also a place where Karl Marx is from. Pretty cool. Definitely a lot of my favorite stuff from Germany's come from there. 'Cause, on the border of France and Germany, place of a lot of industrialization, and also a place of a lot of war and a lot of history. I mean, way back beyond the world wars, like back to like Charlemagne days, and before that, probably before the Romans, and who knows, maybe there was prehistoric robots walking around doing their thing. But big fan of Kraftwerk, so let's get into it. Number five, Radioactivity. Radioactivity is a more one of the more edge cases, I would say, in their classic time period. It has some really great hits, like the title track. Geiger Counter is really cool. Radioactivity, I think, came out after their big hit of Autobahn. And what it did is it took the sort of poppy electro sort of soundscape approach, and I think added in a little bit more sort of found sounds. They used like a literal Geiger counter, and I think it's a really fun record that pushes the edges of what sort of was considered music at the time. This is definitely one of the records that I feel like you can hear their influence from more, I guess, avant garde classical music. Stockhausen is a term you hear thrown out a lot. Sort of, some say almost like Dadaist. Very sort of bizarre, but incredibly catchy still. And you can still dance to it, which I think is pretty great. Number four, Computer World. One of my first I think this was the first Kraftwerk album I ever heard. And there are so many good songs on this one. There is Pocket Calculator. Pocket Calculator. Bomb. Bomb. Bah. This is the album that I think is stealth best children's music of the 80s, actually. This is a great album to play for kids. Um, there's a lot of like funny sounds that they sort of use the synthesizers to create, but it's also incredibly like funky and modern. And part of one of the songs was used in Africa Bambaata's Planet Rock. Another one is used. That's later in the list. Don't worry. And was sort of this album in particular, I feel like, really is the one that sort of bridges the gap between their sort of krautrock past and their sort of like toying around on synthesizer past into the sort of electro and techno and house music future that they basically helped birth. This was a record that was very popular in places that you wouldn't expect for weird German guys who dress up like in all the same nice suits would be popular. This record, along with some of their other ones, was incredibly influential in scenes like Detroit house, early electro, hip hop, really great stuff. Probably personally, my standout is Computer World. It's because it's got that great melody line that Coldplay did a tribute to, but the original, really good. Boop beep ba, boop ba, boop boop beep ba, boop ba. Come on, it's great. You can just hear it over and over again. Number 3. Fun, fun, fun on the Autobahn. This is probably their most famous track, is Autobahn. Autobahn, reference to, of course, the Autobahn, the great highway that connected Germany. You know, it was built in the 30s. We're not going to worry about that right now. But they did a incredible job in Autobahn of reinventing themselves. You know, this was the album that came out after their sort of initial lineup when two of the members broke off to form Noi, which is another great band. Can't really do a top 5 list because they only really have like full 4 albums, but this was a big disco hit, actually, of all things, because it came out sort of right at the start of disco, and it has a very sort of driving beat. You can just sort of dance to it. The title track, Autobahn, in particular, is really important, I think, for kind of showing, I think, what synthesizers could be used for at the time that it came out. You know, when this came out, we were kind of at the tail end, I guess, of kind of peak prog. And while a lot of the krautrock bands had some connections to prog, they definitely were a lot more ragged. And a big thing about prog at the time was, especially with the keyboardists, was just these gigantic, multi-$1,000, like huge collections of keyboards and all this stuff. And while it was very big and they could make all the crazy sounds and they were, you know, doing their little Rick Wakeman things and their little, what's his name from the Emerson or whatever. And while that's good and that's interesting and that we kind of had to go through that, I think, to kind of show that, you know, maybe these instruments would be cooler if we could use them to not just be a really fancy piano, but use them to simulate different kinds of settings and different kinds of feelings. And what Autobahn does is it uses the synthesizers to not just create melody, rhythm, beat, harmony, but it also uses them to create a feeling of literally driving. It has that pounding beat in the background, very simple. Boom, 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 boom. Simple. And then it uses the rest of the band, sort of uses the different synthesizer effects to make you feel brrr, brrr, which was very unique at the time. And that sort of attempt to bring a sort of real life activity and then sort of translate it into an auditory experience is still a unique thing. It doesn't really just feel like a song. It is a song. It's a very simple song. It's a song I would sing to kids, probably. And what it does is it sort of shows the different ways that Kraftwerk would eventually influence music. And this was one of their big commercial peaks. And it makes sense. Also, the album cover is awesome. This is a slightly different album cover that I'm using, but I believe for many covers it was just two straight lines like a highway, and like the line with like the wheel of the car. That's it. Incredibly simple, very sort of modern German, and in many ways, I sort of feel like Autobahn, in a way, and this might be hyperbole. I'm sure it's hyperbole, but what Autobahn sort of symbolizes to me as someone, I'm gonna be honest, I'm Jewish, and growing up, there was a lot of like tension around Germany. Germany was the worst of the 20th century, right? Because we're going to make a hierarchy about that. But what Autobahn sort of represents to me as someone who was never really sure of sort of a relationship to Germany is that this was sort of like, to me, the official beginning. It was it was years after the student riots in '68. To me, Autobahn kind of symbolized the beginning and sort of the planting the flag of a sort of new German culture, a new German national identity that wasn't necessarily built on the nationalism and I would say conservatism of its Nazi and imperial past. And what Autobahn does is it takes the symbols of those time periods, but it totally recontextualizes them. And it's also ironic, it's funny, it's silly, it's dry, which are things that I think, while there might be stereotypes about Germans, is actually a very German thing to me. It's that it's so fun to be on the Autobahn. It's just fun. But it's also like, this is ridiculous. And that tension between sort of industrialization and sort of ironic detachment, along with also having really sweet melodies, is a really winning combination to me. And I really love this album. And the second half has some really cool little soundscapes and stuff, but the core really is the title track. It's the whole first half. And I love it. Number 2, The Man Machine. Man Machine, 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 Machine. Oh my God, this is a good album. This was the album that came out, I believe, after, another album, which we're going to get to. And what Man Machine really did, I thought, was, first off, I think it has the best pop songs like the best collection, percentage-wise, of just catchy, good pop songs. Man Machine hits it out of the park. The title track is really good. We got the Robots, which is just like this great, amazing like drum machine sounds, which I believe they might have actually built a little like drum pad thing just out of like machinery, which is really important, I think, to understanding what makes Kraftwerk good and historically important, but also how they reflected their own environment. Machine has a very sort of industrial, robotic kind of sense, and I also love that they sort of toy a little bit with the colors of communists in this album cover. When this album was created, East Germany, West Germany, they were still divided. And for a lot of the youth, they viewed perhaps some of the more capitalist, more market-based, more, I guess, in a broader term, Western, which is problematic, obviously, as a term, political leanings of the ruling class of Germany. So there was an allure to communism and to socialism, and them kind of playing with this imagery, I thought was really great. It also has one of, I think, the most beautiful songs that Kraftwerk ever did, Neon Lights, which really, I think, sums up that feeling of sort of being in a society that is just constantly growing and is is going from being industrialized to being hyper industrialized. And to me, this album kind of really, I feel like, really sums up kind of the experience that Kraftwerk was having as people growing up in the shadow of World War II and American, British, French, Soviet occupation, and then kind of how their society changed, and how in that I think comes a kind of ironic detachment, which is very important to understand Kraftwerk. But there's still that constant sort of like beauty that they bring in, and Neon Lights really sums it up as it sort of brings the band's sort of sense of, yes, there are these neon lights, there's this city is expanding, it's sort of, we're entering the future, but it's still cold, but it's still beautiful, and kind of that tension, and the ambiguity of it is one of the things that makes this album really great. It also has one of their biggest hits, The Model, which is a classic. It's been covered many, many times, from Steve Albini's Big Black to many others. It's a classic, classic hit. And it shows that when Kraftwerk wanted to, they absolutely would just write just like a good killer pop song. Again, the sort of very sort of Euro thing about Kraftwerk, and almost sort of global in a way too. This idea of this model sort of just being there, being beautiful, but also, again, that sort of detachment and that lack of sort of knowing exactly who you are, where you are, needing to reinvent yourself, which is what Kraftwerk did with their own music over time, but also kind of what bands like Kraftwerk represented to changing German culture, and also just to changing the sound of pop music to such a gigantic extent, from new wave to Carly Rae Jepsen, to, from Africa Bambaataa to Cardi B. And it's a really amazing tribute, I think, that, honestly, that this is not their best album. It's a great album. I absolutely love it. I used to play this one for nanny kids a lot, because the robots had some really good, you can really dance. Simple beats, repetitious, the waves of sound move in and out. Love it. Number 1, Trans Europe Express. Trans Europe Express. I love this album. Now, this album is widely considered to be like their most important album, and I'm sorry, I'm just another one of those people who agrees with the mainstream take. Very smart, very beautiful, very long songs, which I think really emphasized kind of the driving, again, motoric aspect that people talk about with this sort of scene of bands, I guess. That what Kraftwerk did on Trans Europe Express was they really took the lessons, I think, of Autobahn and Radioactivity and expanded it to be like a sort of like a full, like little musical suite. Europe Endless starts the album. It's very beautiful. It's very sort of slow. It's building, and the lyrics are very simple, and it sort of just creates this feeling of being like on a train, or being on the Rhine River, or being, just sort of seeing maybe just the land sort of expanding out beyond you, and you are just one part of this machine of, in this place, the continent of Europe. And it's really interesting to me how this album, while being so Eurocentric, is probably one of their most global kinds of albums in a lot of ways. Because I think, in some way, them highlighting this sort of European connection was themselves. This maybe I'm totally wrong. This is my interpretation of the art. So again, that's kind of what art's about. Um, what they did with this is they looked to create this kind of beautiful and yet hollow and yet full album full of contradictions with, this simplistic beautiful melodies and repetition that in some ways I think was almost like them trying to say, hey, Europe, no more war. But like not explicitly, but kind of in the context. If you think about it, this album came out 32 years after the end of World War II. It had came out like just maybe 27 years after Germany had been split, after being occupied. And what it did was it took all these different musical traditions and recreated it into something incredibly simple and unique that didn't sound like anything else before, which is a really important thing. And I think maybe for some people in our modern context, it might seem odd, or some people would even, I think, interpret it as racist, which I think is really misunderstanding the history of that. A lot of bands, after sort of the big rock and roll wave and the 60s and going into the 70s, a lot of bands wanted to do music that was sort of maybe in the vein of pop music, and of rock music especially, but they didn't want to just copy rhythm and blues and country and rock the way that, well, was sort of the standard, Led Zeppelin already did that. The Beatles already did that. What Kraftwerk and bands like Can, even groups not even from Germany or Europe, from folks like Fela Kuti and Caetano Veloso in Brazil, Gilberto Gil in Brazil, groups all over the world were trying to find ways to take the sort of traditions and feelings of their own indigenous culture, or at least the culture of their world. And it makes sense. If you are a child growing up in the shadow of some terrible, terrible stuff of the first two world wars, and I would say probably even going back to like the Franco-Prussian War, like tons of a society built on industry and war, and that you wanted to find a way to recreate, to sort of recontextualize your own musical traditions, but you didn't just take the old folk music and put an electric guitar on it. So what they did is they sort of took the instincts and maybe some of the melodic ideas, and they also took the industry and the technology and the changes that were going on around them to sort of hybridize it into what we now sort of call electronic music. And this album is, to me, the absolute peak. Really love this album. You should probably listen to it. Of course, it has the great title track, Trans Europe Express, which I never really thought about as this, but it is a funky song. For a song that is just like bum, 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 it's so robotic and so simple that there's all this space around the different beats, And in that means you can really let go. And I think that, to me, highlights the uniqueness of Kraftwerk at their time and why they're such an important band. And how they're actually like a really amazing band for a sense of sort of global unity, like for an international aesthetic, because they made music that was incredibly them. They weren't trying to be, Stevie Wonder. They weren't trying to be Creedence Clearwater. They were trying to be Kraftwerk. And by doing that, they found music that appealed to people from all over the world. And there was a time where you could turn on the quote R&B radio, and you would hear Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Kraftwerk. It wouldn't be a big deal. That was the 70s. That was the early 80s. And it's pretty great. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to have a band that is just so German, be so funky without them like trying to be funky in a traditional way. So, lots of lessons for you musicians and artists can learn from this album. All right, that's been Unpopular Front's Kraftwerk Top 5 Albums. I hope everyone enjoyed this. I'm going to try to do this for a lot of my favorite bands because, I don't know, it's fun. All right. Check out the Unpopular Front podcast on all your podcast platforms. Go to unpopularfront.com for links to individual episodes, perhaps. Maybe you don't want to subscribe. I mean, you should. Subscribe on YouTube. And you can follow me on Twitter at MarxistManny. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.